I'm Lisa Van Dusen, and this is First Person. I'm here today with Bob Wenzlau, who's the founder and CEO of Terradex, which is an environmental information company. And he's also the developer of an application called What's Down. Good morning, Bob.
Morning, Lisa.
Can you give me the 1-minute explanation of what What's Down is and what motivated you to create it?
What motivated me to create What's Down was to help our community, and I also thought about my family, where in particular my daughter was working in an office location that had been affected by chemicals in the soil and groundwater, and there were questions whether these chemicals were affecting her health. And it was hard for people like my daughter who aren't environmental professionals to actually know where the chemicals are and whether they were affecting their health. And with the advent of all the mobile applications, it seemed relatively easy to take my knowledge of the environment and join it with what we can do with web technology to create an application that could help Becky or other adults like her become informed of environmental hazards.
And has it made a difference to you to do this work being in Palo Alto and Silicon Valley? In other words, would you have been as likely to or able to do this if you were located in a different place?
The special thing about Silicon Valley is that Silicon Valley is particularly polluted, and so what made it more viable and important in Silicon Valley was the prevalence of contamination in soil and groundwater that affected a lot more people. So in one respect, the location had the pollution. Now another thing is the expectation of environmental health is much higher in Silicon Valley. And so when you take the expectation of being healthy and you join it with the hazards that are in the soil and groundwater, I think we felt that we had the proper circumstance to grow the What's Down application.
Well, and it's interesting to throw in the technology as well. It seems like that a lot of the technology that made that application possible was created here. Is that true?
Yes. The application began in its infancy with applications like Google Earth. And I recall maybe 6 or 7 years ago visiting Google, listening to some of the developers of Google Earth postulate what it could do for the environment and environmental content. And we, knowing a lot about the environmental content, took it upon ourselves to start putting the information that now is in this mobile application, but putting it into Google Earth and sharing it into the Google Earth community. So that was one model. And then another model that intrigued us was the Yelp model for businesses. And we go, well, if you can find a restaurant or if you can find a store and communicate and talk about the store, well, why can't you do the same for the environment? So we had the notion of creating Yelp for the environment where people could rate an environmental cleanup, discuss pollution, and create engagement around that.
If I were to go to the What's Down site, what would I find and how would I use it?
If you were to come to What's Down, and the way you find What's Down is go to whatsdown.terradex.com. So it's a website right now. You would begin with an experience that's very similar to Google Maps, where it would on a mobile device it would go, we want to know your location, and basically would present where you're standing, and then on the map you would see all these shapes, and you would probably go, well, what is this large pink area? And you would touch the pink area, and it would tell you that this is a groundwater plume, and it would say that it contains chemicals like TCE. And each of the chemicals, for example, like trichloroethylene, which is TCE, you would be able to touch it and discover that it causes the health impacts like cancer. And equally, you might have a question, well, what's a groundwater plume? And you would be able to touch the question mark, and it would explain that a groundwater plume is water that's actually about 10 or 15 feet beneath the ground surface, and describe that within a plume is where these chemicals are confined. So we realized that the experience had to teach people about the environment, but then also give them the same information along the way.
So you're learning if in a given geographical point there's an environmental hazard there under the ground, either in the water or in the soil. And from my own looking at it, you also can find out whether anybody's done something to try to mitigate that issue, right? To improve the circumstance, is that right?
Yeah, what we find in all these environmental cleanups, and so what we've cataloged in What's Down are environmental cleanups. And in the country as a whole, there's probably 1 million of them. In California, there might be 70 or 80,000 of these cleanups, so they're very common. And each cleanup is typically associated with a government agency that has a catalog of reports that you can read and learn about. So when you click one of these sites, it'll carry you off on a link to an underlying government web page that describes the cleanup, helps you understand maybe who you could contact, who the polluting party was. You could see, which company caused the spill, and are they a company that's in good standing. So there's a lot of information, and I think what we tried to do in What's Down was to bring this information in a format that would allow it to be more intuitive to find. Because the information that we have in What's Down is all on maybe 80 to 100 different websites, and what we did was consolidate them. And this is just the United States. We know that this goes all over the world.
Is there a person or an experience for you during your formative years that was significant in shaping your path? I mean, here you are spending time doing this. You have historically been involved in starting recycling in Palo Alto, involved in the compost and anaerobic digestion here. How did this come to be that you have focused on these things?
For me, and my motivation, it might be difficult to tie it to a particular person, but I became inspired by the shortcomings of just hollering, and became more interested in where you could create constructive solutions out of perhaps cleverness. So when we looked at the recycling back in the 70s, we saw the waste. We actually tried some campaigns to label, this would go way back to the 70s, where we tried campaigns to label packaging in the co-op markets, and we got a lawsuit thrown at us as students, and it sort of showed us that if you were to try and do things locally that weren't perhaps quite as disruptive, you could be more constructive. And so perhaps our journey began by trying the curbside recycling, where we could go work with the Palo Alto City Council, create a program that became really doable. No one was going to write a lawsuit. It wasn't going to push the envelope that far, and we could implement it.
Some people were thinking about, the Vietnam War. Some people were thinking about, there were lots of things to be concerned about. You were concerned about waste, and it sounds like you were concerned about being constructive. But why were you thinking about recycling? What got you focused on that?
Why I've thought about recycling or the environment goes way, way back to having an understanding and appreciation that our cities and where we live has a really big footprint on the environment. And I think the first issue back in the 60s when I was a teenager was working on Mineral King, and Mineral King was a Disney development. And I began to learn that people in the cities could affect the environment. And so I became much more interested in the interface between cities and the environment, and as a way to actually protect these special places. And so that's kind of the heart of me, is what our cities do has a very large impact on protecting the special places around us. If we don't do a good job in the cities, then those special places get impacted. And that's, that basically is the heart of me.
It sounds like early challenges for you were things like the lawsuit. Mm-hmm. Do you see any parallels now to some of the challenges?
I actually do. I think one of the challenges that parallels the lawsuit that I had in the early days is a sense in Silicon Valley that we're going to focus towards the future on sustainability and what I might almost call greenwashing. And the greenwashing is a solid commitment. I don't mean to demean it, but they're working on aspects of the environment that are going forward, but they haven't really confronted the legacy of Silicon Valley that's left all this pollution. And I am concerned that that pollution is underappreciated by our community and really needs to be addressed. And that there's a fear that the greenness that Silicon Valley wants to portray is injured or harmed by the promotion or the revealing of these sort of toxic secrets that lay in the ground. And my hope would be that Silicon Valley could actually embrace the if you will, the toxic legacy that they have, bring their special skills to it so that we can be more safe and actually show the country how we addressed toxicity in our environment with the same cleverness that we address social media and mapping and other issues that Silicon Valley is known to be clever. But right now I feel that they to a certain degree we cover it up.
What do you think needs to happen for that to occur?
What we need to happen in the Valley is actually for some of the Silicon Valley leaders that are our business leaders to pick up on this issue and to realize that when we do green or environmental presentations of Silicon Valley, that we can talk about this. And once they start talking about it and we celebrate the cleanups, we engage with the communities that have been affected by these plumes, that it can be shown as a new form of Silicon Valley leadership.
And is there anything that would surprise people about you?
I think what would surprise people about me is something that I reflect on a lot, which is what a long haul and how difficult sometimes it is to just keep at this environmental gig, because I think it's a really hard-fought battle, and that even though I'm always been for the environment, I've always worked on it, it's not always as easy or fun as I might want it to be, and I have to keep forcing myself to stay with the engagement, and I think that's been my reflection.
And you've been trying to combine your entrepreneurial side with your public interest side. Any comment on that and how that's going?
One of the things that jumps out is that the environment is not part of our economic system. I mean, the environment is, no one owns the environment, and so the ability to create environmental businesses that deal with pollution or deal with toxicity are still difficult businesses. And so I feel that what I've created with What's Down and what we're doing with What's Down is a little bit of like an incubator, that if we can make What's Down work in Silicon Valley and show how communities can engage with environmental pollution, perhaps this model can be one that gets looked at when we're dealing with climate change or we're dealing with some of the larger issues. Because if you can create small business models that work in the environmental space, perhaps that they can be extended to some of the larger global issues that we have. So I think that's a little bit of the lesson learned.